In the winter of 1887, deep in the Montana Territory, a man named Samuel Fletcher lived a life defined by solitude and sorrow. His ranch sat at the edge of civilization, where the prairie met the mountains, and where the wind carried both snow and silence in equal measure. Samuel had been a widower for 3 years, ever since a fever had taken his wife, Margaret, leaving him alone in a home built for laughter and children that would never come. The house stood quiet now, its rooms echoing with memories and the creak of old wood settling in the cold. Samuel was a man of routine. Each morning began before dawn, tending to his small herd of cattle and the handful of horses that provided his only income. He spoke little, even to the occasional traveler who might pass through seeking shelter or directions. The townspeople in the settlement 15 miles away knew him as reliable but distant, a man who had retreated into himself after loss. They respected his solitude and rarely intruded upon it. The blizzard came without warning on a February evening, the kind of storm that turned the world white and erased all sense of direction. Samuel had just finished securing his animals in the barn when he heard something unusual, a sound that didn't belong to the wind or the stamping of hooves. It was faint, barely audible over the howling gale, but unmistakably human. He grabbed his lantern and pushed out into the storm, following the sound until he nearly stumbled over a figure collapsed in the snow near his fence line. She was small, dressed in clothing completely inadequate for the brutal weather, her dark hair plastered to her face with ice. Samuel didn't hesitate. He lifted her slight form and carried her back to the house, kicking the door shut against the wind. Inside, he laid her near the fireplace and began the careful work of warming someone who had come dangerously close to freezing. He removed her wet outer garments, wrapped her in blankets, and prepared warm broth, coaxing spoonfuls between her blue-tinged lips. It took hours, but eventually her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and intelligent, filled with fear and confusion as she took in her surroundings and the bearded stranger kneeling beside her. She tried to speak, but the words were in a language Samuel didn't understand. He recognized it as Chinese, though he had only encountered a handful of Chinese laborers in his life, men who had worked on the railroad that passed through the territory years before. The woman was clearly terrified, and Samuel did his best to communicate through gestures that she was safe, that he meant no harm. Her name, he eventually learned through pointing and repetition, was Mei Lin. Over the following hours, as the storm raged outside and night deepened, Samuel pieced together fragments of her story through her halting attempts at English and his patient listening. She had been traveling with a group, she indicated, workers or perhaps refugees. He couldn't be certain. There had been an accident or perhaps an attack. She seemed to struggle with the memory, and she had become separated, wandering for what might have been days before the blizzard overtook her. Samuel prepared the small guest room that had remained untouched since Margaret's death. He gave Mei Lin privacy and warmth, and though she remained frightened, exhausted beyond measure, there was a flicker of gratitude in her eyes when he brought her more broth and fresh water. That night, Samuel sat by his own fire, contemplating the strange turn his isolated life had taken. He had no idea how to help this woman beyond giving her shelter, no notion of where she had come from or where she might need to go. But the storm would last days, he knew, and those were questions for later. The next morning arrived with an eerie silence. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into rolling drifts of pristine white that sparkled under a pale sun. Samuel rose early as always, started the fire, and checked on his guest. Mei Lin was awake but weak, sitting up in bed with the blankets pulled around her. He nodded reassuringly and went to begin his morning chores, pulling on his heavy coat and boots before stepping outside. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Surrounding his house in a wide semicircle, sitting in the snow or perched on fence posts, on the porch railing, on the woodpile, were cats. Dozens upon dozens of cats. Kittens and young cats mostly, in every color and pattern imaginable. Orange tabbies and sleek black ones, gray and white and calico, some with long fur and others short, all watching the house with an uncanny stillness. Samuel stood frozen, his breath making clouds in the cold air, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. He counted as best he could. There had to be at least 70 of them, perhaps more. They made no sound, these small creatures, despite their numbers. They simply sat and watched, as though waiting for something. Samuel's practical mind searched for explanations. Perhaps they had been drawn by the warmth of the house, or the smell of food, though that seemed impossible given their number and the remote location of his ranch. Wild cats didn't behave this way, and these were clearly domestic breeds, or had been recently. Behind him, the door creaked open. Mei Lin stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of Margaret's old robes, her face pale but her expression one of wonder rather than surprise. She stepped carefully onto the porch, and Samuel noticed that she didn't seem shocked by the sight before them. If anything, she looked relieved. She spoke softly in Chinese, words that Samuel couldn't understand, but that sounded like a greeting or perhaps a prayer. And then something remarkable happened. The cats began to move. Not in a rush or a stampede, but in an orderly fashion. The young kittens came forward first, approaching the porch with tiny mews and plaintive cries. They were clearly cold and hungry, some limping, others with matted for suggesting they had been wandering for some time. Mei Lin knelt down despite her weakness, reaching out to touch the first kitten that climbed the steps, a small orange tabby with white paws. Tears began streaming down her face as more of them came closer, and she spoke rapidly in Chinese, her voice breaking with emotion. Samuel understood then, though he didn't know how, that these creatures were connected to Mei Lin somehow. Perhaps they had been part of wherever she had come from. Whatever disaster or tragedy had left her wandering in the wilderness. Perhaps they had followed her, tracking her scent across miles of frozen prairie through the storm. It seemed impossible, but the evidence sat before him in scores of small, furry bodies seeking warmth and safety. The practical demands of the situation quickly overtook Samuel's bewilderment. 70 cats needed food, water, and shelter from the brutal cold. His barn was the only solution, spacious enough and already warmed by the presence of his cattle and horses. He began carrying armfuls of kittens to the structure, making trip after trip while Mei Lin, still weak but driven by determination, helped shepherd the older cats in the same direction. The cats seemed to trust her implicitly, following her gestures and soft words. In the barn, Samuel spread hay and old blankets to create warm nesting areas. He filled every container he could find with water from the pump, and began the task of preparing food. His stores of dried meat and fish, meant to last him through the winter, were quickly depleted as he mixed portions with hot water and grains to create something the cats could eat. The animals fell upon the food with desperate hunger, confirming Samuel's suspicion that they had been traveling and starving for days. As he worked, Samuel found himself watching Mei Lin. Despite her obvious exhaustion and the ordeal she had suffered, she moved among the cats with gentle purpose, checking each one for injuries, speaking to them softly, organizing them into groups as though she had done this many times before. There was something both mysterious and deeply compassionate about her actions, and Samuel felt his isolated heart stir with curiosity and something else he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. Over the following days, a routine established itself. Mei Lin's English improved rapidly through necessity, and she explained in fragments what Samuel had already guessed. She had been traveling with a group of Chinese immigrants who had established a small community in the mountains, trying to survive after the railroad work had dried up and anti-Chinese sentiment had made life in the towns dangerous. They had taken in stray cats, creatures that others abandoned or that had been born wild, seeing in them fellow survivors in need of compassion. When trouble came, whether from harsh weather, hostile locals, or simple misfortune, Mei Lin wasn't entirely clear. The community had scattered. She had fled with what she could carry, and somehow, impossibly, the cats had found her. Samuel found himself drawn into this strange new reality. His ranch, once a monument to loneliness, now buzzed with life. The cats, while numerous, proved to be remarkably well-behaved under Mei Lin's care. She had a gift with them, understanding their needs and behaviors with an almost supernatural intuition. Samuel built additional shelters, repaired corners of the barn to keep out drafts, and made weekly trips to town for supplies, inventing stories about a pest problem to explain his sudden need for large quantities of food. The townspeople noticed the change in Samuel Fletcher. The withdrawn widower now had purpose in his step and spoke with animation about matters he kept vague. Some were suspicious, others merely curious, but Samuel protected his secret carefully, knowing that revealing the presence of a Chinese woman and 70 cats on his property might bring trouble neither of them needed. As winter gradually loosened its grip and early spring began to emerge, Samuel realized something profound had changed in him. The grief that had defined his existence for 3 years remained, but it no longer consumed him entirely. Mei Lin's presence, her quiet strength and dedication to these helpless creatures, reminded him that life continued even after loss, that compassion and purpose could be found in unexpected places. He found himself laughing at the antics of kittens playing in the hay, appreciating Mei Lin's shy smile when he managed to communicate something that bridged their language barrier, feeling the warmth of shared meals after long days of work. The cats themselves seemed to thrive under the combined care of these two unlikely guardians. The weakest grew stronger, the injured healed, and the barn became a haven of warmth and safety. Samuel even noticed that several of the female cats were pregnant, which meant his unusual household would be growing even larger in the months ahead. Rather than being alarmed, he found himself planning expansions to accommodate them, his mind working through problems of shelter and food with an engineer's precision and a caretaker's heart. One evening, as Samuel and Mei Lin sat by the fire after completing their chores, she spoke to him in her improving English about gratitude and fate. She told him that in her culture, cats were considered lucky, and that saving them brought blessings to the savior. She believed their arrival at his ranch was not coincidence but destiny, that somehow the universe had guided her to his door and brought the cats to both of them because they were meant to help each other heal. Samuel, a practical man who had never put much stock in such notions, found himself unable to dismiss her words entirely. The evidence of transformation, both in his life and in the thriving creatures filling his barn, was too powerful to ignore. As spring truly arrived and the last snows melted from the Montana prairie, Samuel Fletcher's ranch had become something entirely unexpected. It was no longer just a place where a lonely widower counted days until his own end. It had become a sanctuary, a place where abandoned and orphaned creatures found safety, where a refugee woman found shelter and purpose, and where a grieving man rediscovered his capacity for connection and care. The story of how it came to be, of the woman who appeared in a blizzard and the 70 kittens who surrounded his house the next morning, remained a mystery in its particulars, but its meaning had become crystal clear. Sometimes salvation arrives in the most unexpected forms, and sometimes healing the wounds of others is how we heal ourselves.